Everybody ready? Everybody hear me? All right, so far so good. Okay, so this is worth the walk for me. Your mileage may vary, but this is what I consider to be the big one for Lowell. This is, sorry, this is, at least in recent memory, the most massive of the mill fires. It's the one that had a significant impact on the way the city has developed since then, in terms of what UMass Lowell's expansion plans were back then versus what's happening now. Industry, I can't imagine, based on what happened with these mills burning, would we have the ballpark now? Would the university have expanded this way? Would we have something completely different? It really did, in my mind, change the course of the development of this part of the city and maybe the city as a whole. So, March 23rd, 1987, 5:45 p.m. Lieutenant McGackie had just, at the time we worked on the old schedule where we worked day shifts and night shifts, so he had just been relieved at the Civic Center and was on his way home, just about to get on the bridge when he looked down the alleyway and saw a fire coming out of a couple of windows at the corner of what was called the Sweeney Building, which was the one with the two large towers. He stopped somehow, went over, called it in, and in the days before cell phones, I'm not really sure how he pulled that one off, but called it in. First alarm was on their way, and they came down just on the far side of this last part of the Perkins Street buildings and came in. So they had a couple of trucks parked in here, and within a few minutes, the entire Sweeney building was virtually engulfed, fully involved. They actually had to back the truck out with the aerial ladder still up, and they had to chop the hoses with axes on the first engine to get them out of there before they were caught. There was so much radiant heat. So if you were standing here at 6 p.m. on March 23rd, 1987, we're all dead, because this is where the main body of fire was in this building. There were 13 total buildings in the complex. 10 were significantly either destroyed or significantly damaged by the fire. It burned for 9 hours before it was brought under control, and they were actually here for almost a week afterwards, hitting the hot spots, because so much of the buildings that collapsed, the embers and the wood burned underneath for so long. 17 communities came to Lowell to give us mutual aid, on top of all of the Lowell Fire Companies, which at the time there were 16. 200 firefighters in total. Because of the huge amount of radiant heat coming off the main building here, which extended back to the attachment, we can see where the division is, where the firewall was. That was the portion they were able to save, but there was another portion of that building, and then there were a few other ones that went that way that were smaller. On the Perkins Street side, they set up, there wasn't one, I don't think there was one Lowell ladder truck there. It was all out-of-town ladder trucks. They basically made a wall of extended aerial ladders with hose streams on them, and they sprayed onto the roof of hub hosiery and created essentially a waterfall that rained down on this side to protect this building, to keep it from burning. UMass Lowell, Lowell at the time, had a $300 million expansion plan to take over the Sweeney building and bring over business and engineering schools. So at the time, the building was just about to be sold for a good amount of money, so there really was no incentive for anyone to want to burn the building. And there was no insurance on it because the building was so, it was only partially occupied, so there really wasn't any reason for anyone to do anything. The cause was never officially determined, but they believed it was smoking in one of the men's bathrooms in that corner where Lieutenant McGackie saw the fire. It wasn't well kept. There were papers and trash thrown about, and it was pretty common, I guess, for people to be smoking in there, and they believed that was the reason. Mill fires, when they burn, they have a tremendous amount of fuel. Back when they were built, mills were among the safest buildings in the city because the mill owners had huge financial investments. They were the first to install sprinklers. The floors, the brick walls were designed to be to prevent fire spread, but they also had huge timbers. I mean, when we talk about this type of construction, firefighters call it heavy timber because the dimensions of the wood are so large. It's very difficult to get them to ignite because the surface to mass ratio of them is so dense that it really you have to have a lot of heat to get it to ignite. The problem is that once you get it to ignite, you're not going to put it out. These buildings did have a sprinkler system, The problem was that in January of that year, 2 months prior to the fire, they had the heat was not on in sections of the building, and the pipes froze and broke open, and the sprinkler system had been shut off. And there was a lot of finger pointing as to who was responsible. The owners tried to say the fire department told us to shut it off, which is absolutely absurd. The fire department would never tell you to shut it off. They'd tell you to fix it today. Yesterday, yeah. So they used over 5 million gallons of water on this fire to control it. And what's interesting is, at the time, there were still two separate water systems in the city. There was the Locks and Canals water system, and then there was the city water system. So the Locks and Canals used to have a reservoir on the top of Fairmount Street in Belvedere that held 2.5 million gallons. It's no longer there. They've since filled it in and built some houses there. But if you're on the top of Fairmount Street on the uphill side, there's some newer houses. You can tell exactly where that reservoir used to be. It wasn't that long ago. They drained it completely empty, and that was the first ever firefighting reservoir built in the city. At the time, the city had to pay Locks and Canals to use that water. The city then developed its own water system later on, but for this fire, a lot of the and many of the other mill yards, the hydrants that you see, and there's a no longer used hydrant just down there behind that one-story building. All of the hydrant water systems in the mill yards were actually maintained by the Locks and Canals Corporation. They were not city water. The problem with that is that once the mills weren't really operating, there was no incentive to keep up those systems. So you had sprinkler systems break, you had water pipes not be maintained, and they were among the oldest in the city, so that the system dated back to 1852, that original water system. So you can imagine that those pipes were, pretty narrowed down from corrosion and rust and everything through the years. They ended up using, after they exhausted the entire supply that was just for the mills, they ended up using the city another 2.5 million gallons out of the city reservoir. But on Christian Hill, the city reservoir holds 33 million gallons. There was a concern that if there had been another major fire in the next few days after that, there was a risk. But there was still 20 million gallons in the reservoir up on the hill. So there's a very resilient system. And then also we have the benefit of being able to use the canals if we have to. Financial losses, other than the university's expansion plan, there were still 31 businesses operating in this complex at that time that were all displaced, and nearly 400 workers lost their jobs. Mill City or Susie Ironworks, and you'll have to forgive me because I didn't write down which one, was located here at the time and had just bought some new major equipment purchases, and they lost everything. They weren't even able to get insurance for their business because there was so little occupied space in the complex. Let's see. They did say, and if you've ever seen pictures of it or news clippings, they were huge crowds. I mean, massive crowds. The fire was visible for 10 miles at least, if not more, and the crowds actually did hinder some of the mutual aid coming in from out of town and some of the firefighting efforts, because the crowd came in behind the trucks, and then the trucks had to get out of some of these areas in quite a hurry. So one of the interesting stories, and I don't know how true it is, but I'll stop with the first fire on this one, is that I was told that Chief Mulligan was not in town when this first started, and the chief who called the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th alarms was from Bedford, Massachusetts. He came in, and the deputies from Lowell were all so occupied, each had taken control of one sector or one building, that there was no one left to call for more help. And the fire investigators they knew the chief from Bedford, and they knew that, okay, we need more help, and he's like, just call it. So it was the Bedford, Mass. Fire chief that whacked the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th alarms to bring in more help to this fire. So that's kind of interesting. Chief Mulligan's not here anymore for me to verify that story, so but that one came from via Harold Waterhouse and Bill Cahill. So all right, so that was the major fire that was here, that one of the what you'd call a conflagration type